I really want to thank you for this opportunity to join my Texas fellow adult educators. I know how busy most of us are trying to transition our work from face-to-face to online, so I really especially appreciate your taking the time to join today and hope that you and all those around you are doing well during these really unusual days. For my part, it's honestly been so refreshing to work on something that actually was already planned to be online. And in the interest of full disclosure, I'll share that while I am not wearing pajamas, I am wearing slippers, and I hope that you are equally cozy wherever you are. Out of respect for your time, I've packed in as much information as I could think of to share, but we'll definitely pause for questions and comments. I'm not really monitoring the chat box as I focus on the presentation, but Liz, if anything big pops up in the chat box, feel free to interrupt me as we go along. So we're going to get started. During this workshop, we're going to talk about two big ideas that come together: how to create a culture of inclusion that helps to promote learner persistence. But in order to do that, we really have to start thinking about how we understand who our learners are. We all have visible and invisible parts of our identity. And so I'd like to invite you to reflect for a second on what elements of your identity are invisible to others, but strongly influence your perspective and actions. Now think also about the invisible parts of your students' identities and how we come to know more about them. As we move forward, think about what you and your members of your team know about your students, how you know, and how this awareness informs your teaching and your learning. During our time together, we're going to explore the theory and research behind student persistence and inclusion, which we often find is a bit different from what people expect. We're especially going to focus on hands-on strategies that can help you translate the theory and research into practice. We have three overarching learning objectives today, and I'll pause for a minute so you can read them. I've organized our time together into these four sections. First, it's important to understand at least some of the theory and research that underpins the strategies we'll discuss. It's also important to understand the role that educational leaders play in setting the foundation for this work, as well as the critical roles that teachers and students play. Finally, we'll consider how to reflect on and evaluate our progress. There are countless adult teaching and learning theories that can support our work. And today I'm going to focus on two, along with three research projects related to persistence and the findings that we can learn from them. I'm also going to share my own program experiences that have been successful. So as we begin to think about research in adult learning theory, I'm always curious to know what theories people rely on. So I'll ask you to take a second and just post into the chat one theory or one theorist that you rely on. And there's no right or wrong answers, obviously. It's just sort of who you've come to think about as you're planning your program. I see David Cole, yep. Experiential learning, great. We're going to talk about all of this. Golden Think, a couple more. Student-centered learning. It's like you all looked at my presentation before I shared it. Embodied learning,
they got great. The cheat sheet version.
Yep. Freer and Knowles. Collaborative learning. Oh, you're making me happy. Trauma-informed care. Oh gosh, we're spending a lot of time talking about that in Massachusetts. Thank you for raising that issue, and we're going to mention it. Project-based learning. Oh, this is making me very happy because I see that our thinking is in the same space. So student-centered learning or project-based learning, great. Thank you for all these terrific ideas, and you're going to see that we're going to refer to them throughout our time together. So great, thank you for sharing that. The first adult, I'm only going to focus on two, and the first is Malcolm Knowles, who many of you probably know is often referred to as the father of andragogy. Knowles identified key drivers of adult learner motivation that are essential for us to understand because motivation links directly to persistence. First, Knowles proposed that adults are self-directed and come to adult education for their own self-determined purposes. As a result, they need to be involved in planning and evaluating their own learning. Also, adults bring with them prior learning and life experiences on which they scaffold new learning. Being able to connect new learning to prior experiences is an important element in keeping students motivated to persist. Third, adults are most motivated to learn in ways that relate to and strengthen their ability to solve real-life problems. We'll talk about using authentic materials for student-identified purposes that help adults see the relevance of their learning. And finally, Knowles proposed, as many of you have suggested in the chat box, that adults are experiential learners. These four concepts are essential to understanding what motivates adult learners to seek education and persist in their learning. The theory that I personally feel most connected to in my work with adults is McCluskey's theory of margins, mostly because I've seen it play out among my learners over and over again. McCluskey proposed that adults need to balance the load that they carry with the power they have available to carry that load. The difference between the load and power is calculated in terms of margins. The greater the margin, the more able adults are to manage demands and live autonomously. This probably looks familiar to you. We know that adults come to us with both challenges and assets. As adult educators, you already know how important it is to help empower students to overcome barriers to attending class and learning. In McCluskey's terms, this means increasing power to support the load. Some learners, as I'm sure you've experienced, come to us with loads that are already greater than their power, so they start off with negative margins. But many of our learners, though, have small margins that don't allow any wiggle room when unanticipated challenges add to the load. You know well what those challenges are. Kids get sick, cars break down, they have to work 3 jobs to pay bills, the list goes on and on. One bad day can upset the entire balance from which learners often find it difficult, if not impossible, to recover. Given this delicate balance, it's impressive that any of our learners are able to persist. But if you add a climate in which students don't feel valued, or if they feel isolated or marginalized, or when their needs as adult learners aren't being met, these are all factors that tip the scales against persistence. This is why we'll be focusing on the importance of learner-centered teaching, goal setting, and advising. As we think about persistence, it's important to consider how we can help to build students' sense of self-efficacy. That is, their confidence in their ability to marshal resources of power to help carry their load. So in addition to those two very, very quick overviews to adult learning theorists, we're going to also refer to 3 research studies. The first is one I commissioned, the review and analysis of high-performing Massachusetts ABE programs, based on a study of 9 programs that had performed in the top performance tier for at least 4 consecutive years. You'll hear me refer to them as Tier 1 programs. Another resource is Making It Worth the Stay, the New England Literacy Resource Center Persistence Study, which involved mini grants to 18 programs that participated in research review study circles, attended a 2-day learner persistence study, and then implemented research action projects with 755 adult learners. In the end, evaluations showed that as a result of the research-based interventions they applied, programs saw an average increase of between 7 and 16% in attendance and 18 and 25% in completions. I'll also refer to research related to fostering a culture of innovation, because all the research in the world isn't going to help if we can't move our systems and people to change. Much of what we'll talk about are the drivers of persistence from the NELRC persistence study I just mentioned. We'll touch on them all, but there's not enough time to do the full project justice in this webinar, so I've shared the link to the report and accompanying website, which includes a program readiness self-assessment tool. At the end of this, I have a sort of a reference and resource list, and so you'll get the links to that for you to explore a little bit further. So let's begin by addressing the role of educational leaders, which I understand is most of you on this webinar, in using this research theory to establish the culture for this work. Like the graphic on the left, directors and managers sometimes see themselves more like conductors who oversee their teams. I'd like you to consider a more collaborative, we're all in this together approach, much like the graphic on the right, in which your entire team owns this work. Research offers common leadership practices that support learner persistence and cultures of inclusion. One we know makes a difference are working conditions, and more specifically, how directors create a culture of shared responsibility and accountability, with opportunities for staff to contribute in meaningful ways. Teachers want to be heard, respected for their professional wisdom, and know that they can make a difference. The persistence study found that programs with strong persistence were able to flip challenges and see them as opportunities. 5 such leadership opportunities are listed here. So first, we see this all the time, and honestly, you can put me in the front of the line of program directors who operated this way. I think we're often well-intentioned and try to shield our busy staff by taking on burdens and the work of managing the program. But the research is clear that this approach is misguided. In our study, 100% of strong programs said that one of the most important factors to high-quality programming is a sense of ownership among staff. As the program manager, it's up to us to foster a culture in which staff are empowered to lead. Second, we have a lot to learn from our students. We need to promote student leadership roles for their own self-efficacy, which is a key driver of persistence. Third strategy relates to the importance of goal setting to help us honor the full range of purposes for which adults come to our programs. But in order to leverage the experiences they bring to enrich their learning in the classroom, we first need to make sure that we get to know our learners well. Our fourth strategy is to help students direct their learning for authentic purposes by providing different ways for them to learn and demonstrate that learning. The one-size-fits-all simply does not work for adult learners who need to find motivation through activities like experiential and project-based learning that is immediately relevant. And several of you posted that to the chat box. Last but not least, research on cultures of innovation tell us that shared ownership is absolutely essential. Program directors need to create a shared culture of accountability where staff are empowered and responsible to take risks and innovate based on data-driven decisions. 100% of strong performing programs in our study reported collective ownership and accountability as critical to their success. When talking about high-quality adult ed programs and persistence, Jane Bella calls us to create a sacred space for adult learners that is safe, open, supportive, and where learners can share their experiences without judgment. If I could pick just one takeaway for you from our time together, it would be this powerful vision for what adult ed programs can and should be. As educational leaders, our goal is to get to the point where we can confidently say that every person in our team contributes to this sacred space in which every learner can thrive. The research tells us that this type of environment matters and has a huge impact on whether or not students persist. As one Tier 1 program director reported, quote, "There needs to be a community of students invested in the program and a comfortable sense of culture and community that people are drawn to. To do that, we must learn about our students' cultures, respect their differences, and celebrate the ways they can enrich our classrooms." We're going to focus on 2 aspects of leadership that can help: staff leadership and lifting student voice. So what strategies do the research tell us to adopt? Strategy 1 is to create regular opportunities for your staff to meet and collaborate. 100% of Tier 1 directors talked about the importance of staff having time to collaborate, share best practices, work together on curriculum, and other program improvement projects. While all Tier 1 programs met at least monthly, most met weekly or biweekly. Next, I'll read this under number 2. I'll read what it says because it's not very clear, but I loved what it said. "I always wondered why somebody didn't do something about that. And then I realized I am somebody." Let's think about the difference between buy-in and ownership. Often, we come up with a plan and then hope our teachers will buy into it. Conversely, if everyone contributes to building the plan from the very beginning, They own it and are much more likely to be committed to its success. High-performing programs rely on staff, teamwork, and staff empowerment. Leadership strategy number 2 is to be clear with your team that you rely on them and empower them. Number 3, research tells us that innovative organizations take risks and are willing to fail. But in order to do that, staff quality matters. Innovative organizations recruit and retain strong teams that are held accountable to high standards that are transparent to everyone. Strategy 3 is to foster a culture of innovation and high expectations that supports all staff in taking risks. Our 4th leadership strategy is to be transparent and explicit about the importance of teaching in inclusive and culturally responsive ways. In terms of addressing diversity and inclusion, most teachers aren't even aware that they teach in ways that make students feel excluded or marginalized. But in the absence of intentional strategies to promote a culture of inclusion, this can be the unintended result. Therefore, it's important to promote ongoing opportunities to reflect both individually and collectively on your staff's understanding of culture and differences. Make discussing your progress a standing agenda item at all staff meetings. You'll also want to support your staff in finding PD that will build their capacity to deal with student differences, like learning disabilities, mental health issues, and cultural sensitivity and awareness. And I know somebody in the chat mentioned the issue of trauma. And here in Massachusetts, we've been really working hard in response to that PD need. And I can share later on with Liz some of the work we've been doing about trauma-informed instruction because it is so critical for so many of our learners. 5th, as part of your plan, your 5th leadership strategy is to consider how you will evaluate your effectiveness in integrating and celebrating learner differences as a way to promote persistence, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And finally, we can't emphasize it enough. You should not be sitting in an office all by yourself or on your couch all by yourself, I guess, literally, poring over reams of data to determine whether or not your efforts have been effective. Your final leadership strategy, assuming that everyone owns the plan, is to create time and space, even though it's virtually these days, for everyone to reflect individually and collectively on your progress. In addition to staff ownership, the research compels us to promote student voice. Student leadership is a win-win for programs and students, and let's talk about why. One way to encourage student ownership is to create group opportunities for student leadership. Consider establishing a student advisory council. These student leadership groups come in many shapes and sizes, but in our program, for example, each class elected a representative to the program's larger student advisory group, and each class met once a month without teachers to discuss issues. Then the representatives brought them to the larger group, which also met without staff. Then the advisory group summarized key issues or topics and brought them to me. Dialogue worked both ways. In addition to students bringing issues to us, we sometimes ask representatives to bring questions to students for their input. In addition to their advisory role, activities that student leadership groups have taken on include creating a student alumni group, building a program Facebook page, and organizing community events. You might also consider appointing student ambassadors who can help with intake, orientation, program tours, and speaking to your governing board and other partners. When you ask students to evaluate the program and teachers, let's remember that adult learners often vote with their feet. Do you reach out to students who have dropped out of the program to ask why? But be ready, if you really value student voice, be willing to ask tough questions and listen to honest answers. And finally, it's important to recognize these student leaders. You can do this by paying them stipends as a recognition of the value of their time, but also certificates of appreciation, letters of reference, posting their names with approval on the program's website, introducing them at events, are other ways to acknowledge their contributions. It's impossible to overstate how vital our student advisory group was to the life of our program and how much their involvement shaped our decisions. As it relates to persistence, students knew well how valuable we felt their voices were. Seeing their recommendations put into action meant knowing they made a difference. This helped them to feel more connected to the program and to persist. I also want to consider two drivers of persistence that fall under the umbrella of educational leadership, and these are from the persistence study. The first is directly related to program design management and the importance of using a range of data to inform your decisions. I see a question in the chat box. Were they given a specific time when they could meet? Our advisory group, students met with the class once a month. So we had the students sort of decided for themselves, to be honest, but once a month for 1 hour. We would take 1 hour of regular instructional time, and that's when the class would meet without teachers. And that was their advisory group meeting time. And the actual larger group that the sort of class reps went to, they met for an hour before class once a month, and we did give them stipends for that time, although they were really tiny, like $100 a year or something for their time. So that's how that worked. So persistence driver one, using data to inform design. I want to talk about our pathway to managed enrollment as an example, which began with feedback from the student advisory group, who reported frustration with wasted time as teachers constantly needed to catch up new students because of our open entry, open exit policy. And I know that this is really tough for programs right now, but you know, I just want to use this as a model for how we use data and students and, you know, staff ownership to figure out how to deal with this challenge. So in response to this feedback from the student advisory group, I hunkered down with the data for a full day and discovered two key pieces of information. First, over a period of 4 years, the number of students we enrolled after April 1st who persisted in the program was, and usually when I'm doing this face-to-face, I make it be a trick question and I ask people what they think the answer is, but it was 0%. 0% over 4 years. Not one student we enrolled after April 1st for 4 years stayed in the program. I was stunned and honestly embarrassed that we didn't even realize that this was happening. So our immediate decision not to enroll anyone after April 1st was easy. Next, I dug deeper to uncover the basis of our turnover problem. Turned out that while 80% of the students persisted, the 20% we replaced turned over and over again. Virtually not one of the 20% persisted. So generally speaking, 80% persistence is pretty good. So the good news was that we didn't have an overall program persistence problem. But the bad news was that we had a 20% disaster. And even worse, we didn't even know it. So we began to look at how we needed to serve those 20% differently. The decision to move to managed enrollment was a total leap of faith, but we moved ahead because the data were so compelling. In the end, because this idea had both student and staff ownership, it ended up improving every performance measure across our program, including improving student persistence and outcomes. So now we're going to move on to student persistence. We're moving on to student persistence, and I'm going to ask you to take a poll. According to research, these are all places where our students drop out and when we lose them. But what does the research tell us about when students are most likely to drop out? So take a second and just answer the poll. Random, there's no clear pattern in the first week, first 3 weeks, in the middle of the year, or when they're almost ready to take their high school equivalency exams. So these are all areas where the research tells us that they definitely stop out. But when do you think students are most likely to stop out?
So like Luann said, there is no right or wrong answer. So we do see lots of folks responding already. We do have a few folks that are still reading, I suppose. Okay, and time's up. We do have, let's see here. So random, there is no clear pattern. We have one person, and then for letter, during the first week, we had 5 out of the 36. The same with letter C, and within the first 3 weeks. A few answered in the middle of the year, and then another couple answered when they're most likely to take an exam. Most of them did not respond. So,
well, the answer is within the first 3 weeks. The research is clear that while students do tend to drop out at all different sorts of times and spaces in the year, when they most drop out is during the first 3 weeks. And so that's why we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those first 3 weeks and why they're so crucial and what programs can do to create a welcoming environment, and use those all-important first few weeks to bond with students and cultivate relationships so that students feel connected to the program. These factors, simple as some of these strategies might seem, the research is clear that those all-important first 3 weeks and the ways that we use them from the very first time we engage to a student to when they're actually sitting in our classrooms are crucial to persistence. So the first time that most of us encounter students is during intake. And this is our first opportunity to engage students, get to know them, and help them to get to know us. So how do we go about fostering that welcoming environment? We all use intake forms that capture required information for reporting, but I suggest that we think about what additional information might be useful. There's nothing to prevent you from getting more information about your students, and the only exception is that you have to make sure you ask all your students the same questions in order to be equitable and to provide equitable access. During intake, it's important to remember that you only get one chance to make a good first impression and to make each and every potential student feel welcome. Let's face it, we're all busy, and it's easy to see why programs often at intake give a student a form to fill out, ask them to take a test, and then hand them a brochure about the program and send them on their way. But think about how intimidating this feels for students, and it's completely contrary to creating the kind of welcoming environment from the very first student interaction that research tells us is key to persistence. Research suggests scheduling intake sessions for cohorts of students instead of individual students. In addition to fostering a sense of community, it has the added benefit of helping eliminate the disruption to staff productivity when they have to drop everything and react to whoever happens to walk in the door on any given day. Done well, intake requires planning and staff involvement. So eventually, we moved from holding them monthly to quarterly. The difference had a huge positive impact in our program and on the persistence of students who walked in the door. Now, as you look at this list of, wearing name tags, introducing staff, it's easy to understand why you might be wondering if all of that actually makes students persist longer. Is wearing a name tag or introducing yourself really going to make a difference? And of course, it's not as simple as that. So I want to pause here to make an important note that given the diversity of our learners, persistence challenges and creating a culture of inclusion are always going to be part of our work. A single solution to this complex challenge is never going to be enough. But what I'm suggesting is a holistic approach that incorporates many of the strategies we're discussing today, can help move programs to create new cultures for students where they feel like they're part of the team and that they matter. Wearing name tags and offering refreshments in and of themselves, of course, are not solutions, but they are a means to an end, and they have shown in the persistence studies to make a difference. At quarterly intakes, we began by asking students to sign in as we greeted each person and introduced ourselves. Each student met for a quick interview, although if you were a student, you'd have perceived it more as a conversation. As we talked, we asked students to fill out a simple one-page form, which we walked them through if they needed help. And where needed, student ambassadors provided translation assistance. At the end of this initial discussion, we do an oral assessment using photos with questions. We then ask them to do a short writing exercise, and after 15 to 20 minutes, I could already tell you which level class the student would be placed in, why they wanted to be part of the program, where they came from, and something about their family. After they were done, another staff person would review our program brochure, help them to fill out a postcard, and ask if they had any questions. By this time, it was clear if somebody needed assistance with translation. At the end of the evening, staff met and reviewed each applicant. With the info we gathered, we could already determine class-level placement and had insights as to what supports might be needing if they were enrolled in the program. Here, I also want to share some of the questions we ask students that are not required for reporting, and I'm just going to give you a few seconds to read through them. So for us, it really helped to know if potential students had school-aged children. It also helped to learn more about their employment status and what kinds of jobs they have now and what kinds of jobs they've done in the past, especially if they're students from other countries. One question we always asked our immigrant students was why they came to America. And yes, it was often a difficult question for students to answer, but it gave us valuable insights to that person that we use to help make decisions about their pathway in the program. Another really important question is who supports you in attending classes. This gives you a ton of insight into whether or not the student has any support system in place. And in fact, sometimes if they're facing opposition to attending. So I want to pause for a second and check in and ask you to type into the chat a couple of examples of questions you ask at intake that help you to better understand your prospective learners. And if you have any big questions at this point, go ahead and type those into your career goal. Yep. Yeah, how many children live at home with you? That's exactly what we asked because it helps us to understand if they have a connection to the school, if they need to be able to talk to their students' teachers, and that was a really valuable question for us too. What are some of your barriers? Yeah. Oh, benefits, great question. I didn't include that, but yeah, if we actually are mandated to ask if people are receiving any form of public assistance, but if you're not, it sure is helpful to have that information. Asking what they think their biggest strength is, that's a great one. When we talked about why they wanted to be in the program, we did ask students, what do you think is going to be your biggest challenge, and what do you think is going to be your biggest strength? That's a huge question. And it does end on a positive note. Great comment, Lourdes. What are you looking to gain? So, okay, and I see one final comment. We ask all these questions and more, whether on PA. I don't know what PA is. Can you say, Rebecca, what PA is? Probation or parole?
Public assistance.
Oh, public assistance. Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. Whether they're on public assistance, probation, or parole. Yep. We also ask, we're required to ask if they're mandated or not. So, you know, sometimes people are court ordered or for whatever reason they're mandated. When you want to talk about motivation and persistence, those are really important things to know. So thank you for sharing. Yep, these are all, I'm happy to hear that you are not bound by the mandated questions or that whatever form it is that you all use in Texas, which probably looks like a lot like the one we use in Massachusetts because it's based on all the data we have to report to funders and to the federal agencies. So yeah, these are all great ways to get to know our students. So well done. I'm sharing this postcard that we developed. This is obviously a replica, but this is a postcard that we gave to students after intake. And we often had long wait lists. I'm not sure how it is in Texas. And, you know, I know in this economy things have changed, but in this economy, we are all going to have lots of unemployed students who will likely be showing up at our doors. So after people left intake, we often found it difficult to reach people by phone. And so we created this program postcard that we asked them to fill out and explained that we'd mail it to them when we had an opening in the class for them. We pointed out the number to call and to confirm that they wanted to be in class when they got it in the mail. More often than not, people recognized the postcard when they got it in the mail because they had completed it and would show up postcard in hand to confirm that they could begin the program. This ended up being one of the most effective ways to communicate with potential students. And in terms of persistence, it is surprising, but it really did help to foster that all-important sense of connectedness to the program. Another program, we didn't do this, but another program that we work with asks people on the wait list to call in every month to confirm that they're still interested in being in the program or being on the wait list. So, you know, again, this speaks to whether or not you have wait lists. I know that really varies from program to program and state to state, but in Massachusetts, we have long wait lists. Even now. So if they're on the wait list, they have to call in. Talk about taking ownership of your learning. They have to call in every month and confirm that they want to be on the wait list. And in fact, the program tried it as an experiment, and they found that students really did stay more connected to the program. They had a sense of urgency about being in the program, and when they finally had an opportunity to come to the program, they were far more committed because they understood that it wasn't a done deal, that they had a role to play in securing a spot. And finally, as part of intake, we always are mindful that we're trying to build long-term relationships with students. And sometimes students just aren't ready to make the commitment to classes, whether they realize it or not. So when meeting with learners, we felt it was really important to help them determine if the program is the right fit and if this is the right time. The persistence study, in fact, found that with better intake, one unanticipated outcome was that more people decided not to attend the program. While this was initially disappointing, what programs realized was that these students would have dropped out eventually anyway. So having them realize up front that it wasn't the right fit before they started was, in fact, a great outcome. In our program, because we did focus on cultivating long-term relationships, so students would come back when they were ready, we never sent anyone away empty-handed. We developed a list of partner and community organizations that we would refer students to. One example was the Literacy Volunteer Program at our local library that offered more flexible tutoring hours. So we're going to move on to talking about intake and start talking about orientation. So you've done this intake process. You've got a bunch of students on your wait list, or maybe you don't even have a wait list. They're just ready to come to class. So how long is your formal orientation? This is another poll, so I'll stop talking and let you answer, give people time. How long is your formal orientation process when you bring students into your program? Some people have no formal orientation. They go right to class, and then you can see the other choices, 1 to 3 hours. So I see a lot of people 1 to 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours, multiple days, 3 hours plus. So what the research tells us is that the answer should be multiple weeks. And I guess a lot of you are going to probably find out that it's closer to that, depending on what you count under orientation. So research suggests that the orientation is a critical time, again, those first 3 critical weeks that we talked about, to bring learners into a community where they feel welcome. In order to be effective, orientation needs to be a formal, sustained process over time, not a one-shot deal where you explain the attendance policy, tell the student which class to go to, and then wish them luck as you send them on their way. You'll notice that a lot of strategies around intake apply to orientation too, and especially in terms of creating a welcoming environment. Research shows that orientation with cohorts of students makes a difference. And so the first step is to move away from individual to group orientation. Programs in the persistence study found that effective strategies included, again, having staff wear name tags and introduce themselves, offering light refreshments, and giving tours of the facilities, but also following group sessions with individual meetings with advisors. Our orientation was 2 weeks, for example, during which students met with staff, met with student ambassadors, and also were required to observe at least 2 classes. Students were required to attend the full 2-week orientation because we wanted them to make informed decisions about how realistic it might be to commit to the whole program. The truth is, if they couldn't make it through the first 2 weeks, they definitely wouldn't have been able to make it in the program. So this blend of sort of talking about the program, meeting with students, observing classes, gave them so much more information about whether or not they were really prepared for what it meant to be in the program. One reason why orientation is so important, and a sort of a sustained orientation, is that it helps students to deal with the in theory versus in practice dilemma. In theory, of course, all the students want to come and attend class. Of course they do. But it's more helpful for them to experience the reality of what it means to attend class. Orientation should balance opportunities for students to learn about the program, share time with students and teachers, and to sit in and observe classes to experience what they're like. We also introduced student handbooks, which I'm sure many of you have, and key policies. But we asked students to sign a student agreement acknowledging that they would comply with the policies. And we learned pretty early on that students pay a lot closer attention and asked many more questions when they knew they were going to be asked to sign something. We planned orientation so new students could interact with current students, again, creating a sense of community and making them feel welcome. and also helping our current students understand the important role that they play. These are some examples that surface in the research about ways to use orientation to create a welcoming community, which, remember, turns out to be a key factor in student persistence. Because those 3 weeks are crucial, we are spending a lot of time talking about them. One program asked student ambassadors to explain to new students 5 things they wish they had known when they started the program. Another program prints refrigerator magnets with the program phone number and script for how to call in sick. Other programs reported that students loved it when they got student IDs. We also suggest that you help students establish program email addresses, so either an official email address from the organization or Gmail account so that everybody has a working email account. If you don't already have one, think about creating a program website. And free platforms like Wix and Weebly offer templates that are easier to use than you probably imagine if you haven't already done it. Recording tours of the program, testimonials from current and former students, and welcoming messages from staff can help students feel connected. And yes, I've been a program director, so I can hear some folks thinking, is she out of her mind? I don't have time to create a website or even know where I would begin. So, and I definitely get it. And I would suggest that if you don't have the time or expertise, give it to your students as project-based learning. As part of orientation, the research also suggests that you explicitly address persistence challenges and strategies, as well as options for stopping out. Be upfront that there are many times when students will probably struggle, and assure them that you're there to help them through the rough patches. As an example, we created a leave of absence policy. So if students had to stop out, as long as they came to us to talk about how we could give them ways to continue their learning, rather than exit them from the program, we grant an approved leave of absence. So when they were ready to return, we'd place them on the top of the wait list and make sure that they could get back into the program. And so now I'm going to ask you to post to the chat some other strategies that you use to create a culture that makes students feel welcome and bond with the program.
Lots of great stuff so far, Luann. It's just a wealth of information. So I'm excited to see what our participants share on the strategies on how to make their students feel welcome. Let's see, they're feverishly typing. I can see the smoke.
Oh, well, and if you don't have any other thoughts, what does this make sense to you? Does it seem odd? It comes from the research. Is it surprising, not surprising? Or are you just sitting there going, yep, we do all that too? So helpful for me to see where people are thinking.
I do know of a program that they use student ambassadors, and when they have a brand new student in that classroom, then the student ambassador would navigate, like, these are the resources we use, this is when we have a break, and things of that nature that to put them more at ease. But we do have a comment here from Ms. Jackson. I share experiences from my own, ask students to share information about their children. My students and I enjoy talking about our families. And so, yes, it is easier on the program. So Sonia says, when new students enter an existing class and continuing students buddy up with them to share class info, et cetera. Oh, nice.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. If you look at the persistence study at some point, there's a whole piece about mentoring. And it's so challenging, this idea of buddying up and mentoring, and it's complex that I didn't sort of add it here, but it's a great strategy. It just takes I want to acknowledge the thoughtfulness that needs to go into doing that well. Kelly commented about having orientations in multiple locations, like the local workforce centers. That's such a great idea, particularly if transportation isn't a barrier or any of that, or having, one of the things programs here are doing is they're having their staff go to the workforce centers and talk about their services, and they're having folks from the workforce centers come to our programs and talk about their services. So definitely that, larger picture is so important right now. Games and activities, Facebook page, perfect. Remind.com is a tool that I know programs use a lot. That's been great. Students, they share stories. These are all wonderful ideas. Icebreakers, we're going to talk about that. Perfect. Yeah, and this final comment from Rebecca before we move on is create relationships. That exactly is what the persistence data tells us. And also this idea of creating a culture of inclusion. They kind of merge together. Having relationships with our students. And there's something somewhere, I didn't put it in because I couldn't remember where I said it, and so I couldn't cite it. It's about students really knowing that we care about them while they're in class, after they leave our classes, that we care about them as people, not just as students. So critical to student persistence. So thank you. These are wonderful strategies. I'm going to ask to get the notes from the chat box, and I'm going to use all your great ideas and keep them in mind when I'm talking to other folks about this. So thank you so much for sharing. And the 3 R's, relationship, relevance, and rigor. Excellent. Wonderful ideas. Thank you so much for sharing. So the last piece we're going to talk about in terms of orientation is I wanted to share that in addition to group orientation, our students should also be meeting with advisors. Some people call them counselors, some people call them advisors, whatever whatever term you use, to talk about individual goals, barriers, assets, and challenges. So in Massachusetts, we have these indicators of effective advising. You may have your own in Texas around these 5 areas. And I shared a link in the resources. And while they're currently being updated, they definitely stand the test of time and can help you assess where strengths and gaps in advising exist in your program. This resource includes a program readiness self-assessment rubric that might be helpful. And, not surprisingly, all the research talks about the importance of advising to help students in these areas to persist and reach their goals. Advisors are key in helping students identify barriers to persistence and strategies to overcome them. That's why so many directors make part of advising role to reach out and cultivate relationships with community partners to leverage their resources. Helping students get connected to resources around transportation, housing, childcare, financial assistance, mental health counseling, and all sorts of other services can make all the difference in a student's ability to persist. And so now we're gonna move on to talk about teaching, but I wanted to pause because these are all areas that I think program directors really have to offer leadership in, how your program is designed and managed. So I'm gonna pause for questions at this point before we move on.
And I know that they're typing away, but lots of great feedback from the earlier comments. Someone had mentioned that they really liked your idea of the quarterly intake model that you presented. Mm-hmm. And then Lourdes Tovar had mentioned how instructors engage their students with sharing stories. Someone else mentioned they do icebreakers. So, they're liking those ideas, but I don't see any questions at this time, and I'll let you know when someone posts something, and then you can take them if you like.
Okay, so let's move on to teaching. So these are 2 models of teaching, and the graphic on the left is sort of the traditional K-12 version where the teacher is in charge of the students, and the model on the right is more what we want to think about, which is this more collaborative relationship between teachers and students. And so many of the ideas that you suggested in the chat box tell me that you really understand that this is what most adult educators align with. So we're going to look at some instructional strategies that align with this model, are fairly easy to adopt, and that research tells us support learner persistence. And throughout this discussion about teaching, we want to focus on students and their self-identified and authentic purposes for learning. So we move from teacher-centered to learner-driven instruction to help meet the needs of adult learners as described by Malcolm Knowles for self-direction and relevance. And of course, all that supports motivation and all that supports persistence. Some of you have already mentioned icebreakers. Great suggestion. So promoting persistence means cultivating a culture where students feel welcome and respected in the classroom too. How do we help our teachers begin to do this? Again, by creating community, getting to know each student, and fostering an environment where the differences students bring to class are viewed as assets and enrich the collective learning. A couple of examples of icebreakers. Again, I agree, you all suggested it, it's a great suggestion, but I'll just give you 2 icebreakers that I've used that I enjoy, and you probably all have tons too. One is to explain how you got your name and teach us how to pronounce it properly. One really simple element of creating a culturally inclusive and sensitive classroom is to make sure we pronounce people's names correctly. So using it as an icebreaker, how'd you get your name, and let's all pronounce it correctly, can really set a positive stage for moving forward. Another I've used successfully is to ask students to bring in one thing from home that's important to them or that is meaningful to them and explain why. And of course, the teachers would bring in something from their home too and share. We also think teachers should facilitate the discussion on how to set class norms. That can be done in small groups with one person who reports out or in a large group, and ask students to decide how often they think they should revisit the norms to be sure that they're being followed and also to check in to see if they need to be. Other ways that put students at the center of instruction is to have them organize program activities. For example, in our program, we had a schedule for when each class would be in charge of snacks for class breaks, and students also organized a family night when they could bring members of their family to sit in on classes and see what they're learning, and they decided to end the evening by doing reading groups with their children. So it was, I take no credit, it was not my idea, it was all theirs. It ended up being a really positive and fun evening. I want to focus on goal setting because it's so key for many reasons. First, it helps us to better understand our learners and helps them feel connected to us and each other. But another reason is because our teaching should be informed by and reflect student goals. Persistence research provides us with a lot of guidance about what effective goal setting looks like. If you're working with beginner level students, be sure to simplify forms and use pictures. Goal setting should always be student driven, but guided by teachers and advisors who can help learners imagine goals for themselves that aren't on their radar. We required students to set at least 3 goals, one of which had to be academic and one of which had to be personal. In one of the persistence programs, for example, 80% of their students set a goal to feel proud of themselves. An evidence-based practice we used in our program was to have teachers lead goal-setting lessons during class time. So our teachers, not the advisors, led goal setting. Students in persistent study programs often shared goals and kept class charts to monitor progress and celebrate when a classmate achieved a goal. Attention to goals needs to be ongoing. We had students write goal journals every month that teachers and advisors reviewed and gave feedback on. They'd write about 1, what steps they had taken during the past month toward meeting their goal, 2, their plans to make progress during the upcoming month, and 3, what support they might need. And finally, we always celebrated when a student achieved a goal, sometimes at class break, sometimes with a pizza party if it was something big like becoming a citizen, and always with recognition. I'm going to go through this really briefly, but I gave you the link. Another resource is our Life Skills College and Career Readiness Guide that we created to embed real-life hands-on tasks according to 3 domains: life skills, college readiness, and career readiness. This responds to the reality that virtually every adult education classes has a mix of learners with different purposes and goals. In the guide, tasks are organized at the beginner, intermediate, and advanced level, so it can be used with all learners. And it's intended to support a culture in which everyone pays attention to and integrates student purposes throughout the program. It introduces skills and tasks at the beginner level where students can practice in the safety of the classroom environment, and then scaffolds to introduce increasingly more complex and independent tasks, including moving out of the classroom and into real environments. These activities are intended to honor individual student purposes while helping them to build self-efficacy, 2 factors that are key to student persistence. Here's an example of how a persistence strategy can be introduced at the very beginner level and then build in complexity across levels. At the beginner level, students begin by learning that they need to call in if they're going to be out and how to do so. But by the advanced level, they're moving toward taking ownership of their own learning by tracking barriers to persistence and reflecting on how effective the strategies they've implemented to overcome them have been. This helps to create ownership for students and helps them build valuable skills they will need to succeed in their jobs. It's another example of being explicit with students about persistence strategies. These are other examples from the guide that students can tackle inside and outside of the classroom that can be rich opportunities for standards-based lessons. Students can choose their own activity according to their own purpose, or you can encourage students to work in teams. Malcolm Knowles observed that adults learn best from experience. This kind of project-based experiential learning helps to make learning relevant and responsive to student purposes. These are some other examples of experiential learning where students can select from a variety of ways to learn and demonstrate what they've learned. So for example, let students be leaders in the class. Start each class as students are coming in by writing a number or word of the day on the board, and ask each student as they arrive to write something about how that word or number is relevant to them. Allow students to take turns being teachers, for example, preparing vocabulary lessons or math activities, or they can share a piece of writing for class editing. Or just tell students they're going to take turns teaching a lesson and let them decide how to do it. Another fun activity is to ask students to vote with their feet. To do this, you pose an opinion question and post different answers in corners of the room, and ask students to go to the corner of the room with the answer they agree with most. Then ask students to explain or defend their choice. After people from all the possible answers give their rationale, ask anyone if they want to change positions and why. What's most interesting about watching this is how people move after listening to each other's ideas. And for those of you with us today who worry about asking already busy teachers to do more, think about all the ELA standards that these activities address. It's not about doing more as much as it is about shifting what you already do to make it be more learner-centered and learner-driven. Another one of my favorite activities was to give students the assignment to do their best work. I tell them they can pick a topic and then decide how to present their learning in a way that shows their absolute best work. I told people to research a topic, demonstrate what they've learned, and share their learning with classmates. So initially, students were puzzled and really pretty frustrated with the lack of guidance, but over time, we worked on common elements like outlines, timelines, research, essay structure, presentations, all standards-aligned work. What we ended up with was an array of amazing products. One student who was an artist researched French vineyards and drew different types of vines on each page of her report, which she wrote entirely by hand in calligraphy. In addition to being informative, it was a work of art. Then there was the comedian in the class who did hilarious skits about the kind of language you would need in an emergency, complete with refrigerator box cut into an ambulance. Or the student who cooked a typical native meal, turned our class into a restaurant complete with menus, shared recipes, and taught a vocabulary lesson on food. Other students created travel brochures of their native country and taught us how to sing part of their national anthem. By now, you may be wondering what these all have to do with persistence. Each of these activities harken back to adult learning theory. They put students in the driver's seat to leverage prior experiences towards new learning relevant to their own context. It still allows for rich academic learning, and these strategies empower students to be self-directed. I see a comment in the chat box about ideas for beginning speakers of English. The guide, the College and Career Readiness Guide, has like 20 pages of beginning activities for beginner learners, and I don't have time to go into all of them now, but if you go to that link, you'll see it's really broken up into beginner, intermediate, and advanced. There's a whole section on beginner level activities that you can use in your classroom. Another important strategy is to help learners monitor their own progress. And research is clear on this point, helping students to believe they can succeed by helping them to recognize their accomplishment and progress is a strong driver of persistence. Two strategies I'll share is that in our program, we did formal student evaluations, almost like on the job. Students wrote a self-assessment, and then the teacher would write an evaluation, and they'd trade. When they met, they'd acknowledge accomplishments and progress, check in on any areas that didn't align, and set new goals. And I know some programs organize thematic units that are 8 to 10 weeks long, and then meet with students to review their progress after each unit. It's also important to build students' metacognitive skills around learning. For example, research tells us that explaining how many hours it takes to advance a level, the importance of growth mindset, or the theory that your brain grows when you learn from mistakes are valuable tools for students. They promote persistence because understanding how we learn helps students to navigate their own learning, see results, and persist. One idea I loved from the persistent study programs was holding an annual Night to Dream, designed to help students to think about short-term goals in the service of long-term aspirations. The program found that this significantly improved students' determination to persist in meeting their goals. I really encourage you to look at the details in the persistence study. It was fascinating, and I honest to goodness, wish I had thought of it myself. We also asked students to do community service. It gave them valuable transferable skills and experience to put on a resume and a sense of pride to give back to the community in meaningful ways. And while we know our students are busy with many demands on their time, we found that many already were volunteering in churches or schools. Over time, our students took over, for example, managing our holiday celebrations, for which we invited families, members of our organization, and community partners. As an example of how students can soar, one year they set up a tree decorated with hats, mittens, and scarves that they had knit themselves to donate to the homeless shelter. And for those who couldn't knit, there was a table full of food and clothing that they had donated. How did this help persistence? Students really understood that they were part of the fabric of not only our program, but also of our community. And over time, many of our graduates went on to volunteer in partner organizations, including the literacy program, to help students on wait lists for our program. The research also shows that offering supplemental strategies for learning outside the class is found to support persistence. And these are some of the strategies shared by persistent study programs. Take-home packets, being able to work from a distance, and also intentionally talking about step-out strategies with students really helped to encourage them to persist and also to stop out and come back when they were ready. We want to make sure that when your team creates a plan for how to address persistence, that you have ways to review your progress and evaluate its effectiveness. Be ready to shift as you look at new data and new ideas, and be sure that all your staff understand the critical role they play in supporting learner persistence. And also make sure your students understand they're part of the solution as well. It helps a lot if you can intentionally carve out time, like at staff meetings, to keep this on everyone's radar so you continuously discuss your progress and innovate. And we'll come back to this prompt, like let's think about this slide that we started with, and hopefully, you now have some new ideas for how to approach this work, how to think about what you know about your students, and how this really influences the teaching and learning that happens in your program. And I'll close by sharing this quote, which it's one of my very favorite quotes, and it helps me to make tough choices and reminds me why I do the work I do, and helps me to choose the work that I choose to do, actually. And I'm hoping that as you move forward, perhaps it will help guide you to implement and sustain change. And last, in terms of next steps, this is the website to the Persistence Study. You're going to get all these links. And the Persistence Study website has a program readiness self-assessment. And as great as it is as a self-assessment, it's equally a tool to look at sort of indicators and say, oh yeah, we do that. Oh gosh, we could do that. And, you know, the Persistence Study isn't terribly long. I have it in front of me. It's like, how many pages? It's like about 80 pages, but well worth the read and an easy read. Okay, so finally, I am going to stop talking. Thank you so much for hanging in there. I know this is a lot to go through. And I'm just going to ask for your thoughts, questions about anything I can elaborate more on. The floor is yours.
Oh my goodness, Luann, what a wonderful presentation, lots of information, the resources, the research that you have provided is just phenomenal. So, ladies and gentlemen, I do encourage you to post your questions. Now's the time. Here's your opportunity. You know, don't go home or leave your couch without answering those burning questions. So lots of great ideas. So if you do have maybe some examples that you'd want more information, let us know, and you could ask Luann now, and we'd love to hear what your questions are. But Luann, such a wonderful presentation. We do have lots of wonderful comments saying thank you for everything. Thank you so much for this valuable information. Thank you. And this was a great bit of information. Thank you, Luann. And I think that says thank you in another language. I'm not too sure. I'm just using my imprint skills here.
Yeah, I just also wanted to chime in that my contact information, I know it's a lot to think about, and I'm really hoping that you can at least find one or two things you can go back to your program and talk to your teams about. But as you go back, I know it's when the rubber meets the road. Oh, it sounds great in theory. And then you go back and you try things and you're like, now, wait a minute, what did she say? And what was she talking about? So I have included my contact information, and I'm really happy to respond to emails. As you start to think about this and you have other questions, or I can provide more examples or more detail, I really encourage you to, contact me by email. I'm happy to continue this really important discussion about how we can serve our students well.
Yeah, so a lot more thank yous, lots of accolades, and, Luann, I couldn't thank you enough myself, very informative, great session, and we have folks from our Texas State Workforce Office, so thank you so much for joining us. We have Ann Savino, and then we have some of my colleagues like Beth and Tracy. Thank you for joining us. And, Luann, I do want to thank you for the preparation that was involved. She's been working on this since February, as you can see, or probably even earlier. As you can see, the amount of information and research that went into putting this together. I want to thank everyone for coming together and doing this. I know that it's a stretch, but as you can see, it was jam-packed. We do have a question here. How do you do virtual intake? So that's a great question.
Oh, that's a wonderful question at times like this. So lots of programs, we have distance learning programs, and they do their intake virtually. So some of it is they use all sorts of different tools. Some of it, and you probably use tools in your program. Some of it is just by email. You can think about using Zoom or WebEx for virtual sessions. We didn't use it today, but of course WebEx and Zoom have free versions that you can use for a limited number of people, but presumably you wouldn't be doing huge groups of intake. But you can use these, and we didn't use it today, but they have, of course, video capacity. So you could be using video while you're talking to your students. You can use online tools like Padlet. I don't know if we talked about Padlet, but Padlet is it's free, it's online, and you can create a community of practice and have an ongoing conversation where people can talk to each other. You could set up a Google Classroom. Any kind of virtual tool that helps to get students engaged can work during these, times when being face-to-face is pretty much impossible for most of us.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions? Now's your time. We do have a couple more minutes. More thank yous is what I see. And I do want to post Luann's contact information once again. So if you want to email her, you heard from the presenter herself that she is more than happy to answer those questions. Of course, with everything going on right now, I can only imagine your workload, Luann, but thank you so much for joining us today. I also want to thank Dr. Olga Escamilla for helping out with our post-production and our technical assistance, so thank you for joining us. But I do want to thank everybody else for joining us today. And Olga does say it is great that we have someone from World Ed joining us. Great session today, absolutely. It's always great to hear great feedback, learn from others. And, I got to share that we went to school together. And so it gives me a great sense of pride to be able to do something outside of a classroom assignment. So this is just wonderful. Thank you, Luann. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
And I want to close by thanking everyone to hang in there for 90, I know what can be very long minutes of sitting on a webinar. Speaking of persistence, I appreciate your persistence.
Yes, that's a very good example. So yes, take care, everybody. Be safe and take care. You did a great job, Luann.